When I have seen by time's fell hand defaced the rich proud cost of outworn buried age, when sometime lofty towers I see down raised, and brass eternal, slave to mortal rage, when I have seen the hungry ocean gain advantage on the kingdom of the shore, and the firm soil win of the watery main, increasing store with loss, and loss with store, when I have seen such interchange of state, or state itself confounded to decay, ruin hath taught me thus to ruminate, that time will come and take my love away. This thought is as a death which cannot choose but weep to have that which it fears to lose.
30 years ago, I wrote, apropos I've long since forgotten what, death is the new pornography. Although death may have been new in the 1950s, it was very much the pornographic vogue in the 1550s. And by the 1650s, as the monuments of any old church will demonstrate, death was not only pornographic, but high camp, as the Totentanz became a European craze. So by the time that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, I shall but love thee better after death, the grisly fun was sickly sweet, and Baudelaire stewed himself in it, chancres and all, while Edgar Allan Poe booked himself into Juliet's tomb, where Shakespeare had really let himself go as interior decorator, crowding the crypt with the skulls and the dust and the jellies of our mortality. Shakespeare's obsession with death seldom deserts him for long. Sometimes he whistles bravely at the dark and asserts that those lines of his that celebrate his love will long outlast death itself, though he and his beloved both be dust. Sometimes, as in Hamlet, he frets at the thought that there might be a continuing of existence after the worm has done its work, and he wonders what dreams his ghost might dream. Sometimes he sees death as nothing more than the erasure of all things human and human-made. It is to this, his darkest mood, that Sonnet 64 belongs. Although we, in this atomic time, have apocalyptic visions and realities beyond anything that Shakespeare could imagine, death is less with us as an idea, or even as something witnessed, than it was, say, to a man of the Renaissance, or even to my own southern great-grandparents who buried more children from what they call the bloody flux than ever they raised. Today we have our mortuaries and our funeral parlors. How Shakespeare would have liked to do up a funeral parlor. We have our plastic hearts. We have our euphemisms. We do not die, we pass on. We fall from the perch. We are gathered up. We cross the shining river. Memento mori is out of fashion with us. But for Shakespeare, it was a central preoccupation. Because due to no accident, the verb to die had two meanings for the Elizabethans. One was to cease to be, and the other was to cease to be in the act of love. Now, when death means orgasm as well as death, the world is a very different place from the one that we know. And it's curious that this identification of death with the sexual act should have preceded by 4 centuries a modern biological theory which maintains that life began with a cell, or the amoeba, which does not reproduce or die, but simply splits off its heir and duplicate. Should the amoeba have a consciousness, it must be singularly serene and untroubled, with no apprehension of its terminus, as it does not terminate. But our human line was aberrant. Over millions of years, we divided into 2 sexes. Thus, each of us is born an individual, grows up, procreates, and then, task of perpetuation fulfilled, dies. And no wonder the tragic sense is so developed in us. Yet one wonders at the prescience of the Elizabethan who sensed that the sexual act and death are somehow the same, which indeed they are. Had we not been sexual creatures, we might never, like the amoeba, have known death. So, as a palliative for death, we are given death, as the Elizabethans would say, or as we would put it, in order to compensate us for our death, we have been given sexual love and procreation. But despite Mother Nature's amiable gift, many human beings feel that we have all been somehow shortchanged. This feeling is sometimes known as the tragic sense, which Sonnet 64 reflects in spades. When I have seen by time's fell hand defaced the rich proud cost of outworn buried age, when sometime lofty towers I see down raised, and brass eternal slave to mortal rage. In this first quatrain, the poet meditates on those costly man-made things destroyed and buried by time. The meaning of the second quatrain is straightforward enough. Time is now the hungry ocean which devours the kingdom of the shore, which in turn absorbs the sea, and each knows loss and loss. In the last quatrain, Shakespeare makes a very curious shift. When I have seen such interchange of state, or state itself confounded to decay, ruin hath taught me thus to ruminate, that time will come and take my love away. The American poet and critic John Crowe Ransom accuses Shakespeare of incompetence when he introduces the lover here rather than in the last couplet. Ransom seems to me to be too strict. Neither for good nor ill was Shakespeare Pope. But what made Shakespeare shift in mid-quatrain? I suspect that he realized that he was becoming political and suddenly brought himself up short. When I have seen such interchange of state, or state itself confounded to decay, ruin has taught me thus to ruminate. Shakespeare could easily be saying that the state of the Virgin Queen, that the state of England was showing signs of decay, even ruin. I leave to those who think Shakespeare crypto-Catholic to develop this theme. But whatever he might have had in mind, with the nimbleness of a gazelle, he sidesteps politics and tells us that the ruin of states in general has taught me thus to ruminate, that time will come and take my love away. This is worthy of Bertolt Brecht at a congressional hearing. I rather wish that Shakespeare had completed his political thought. Love is always the same, but states, as he reminds us, do change.
When I have seen by time's fell hand defaced the rich proud cost of outworn buried age, when sometime lofty towers I see down raised, and brass eternal slave to mortal rage, when I have seen the hungry ocean gain advantage on the kingdom of the shore, and the firm soil win of the watery main, increasing store with loss and loss with store, when I have seen such interchange of state, for state itself confounded to decay, ruin hath taught me thus to ruminate, that time will come and take my love away. This thought is as a death, which cannot choose but weep, to have that which it fears to lose.
Since brass, nor stone, nor earth, nor boundless sea, but sad mortality o'ersways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wrackful siege of battering days, when rocks impregnable are not so stout, nor gates of steel so strong, but time decays. Oh, fearful meditation! Where, alack, shall time's best jewels from time's test, or what strong hand can hold his swift foot back? Or who his spoil of beauty can forbid? Oh, none, unless this miracle have might, that in black ink my love may still shine bright.
In the early sonnets, Shakespeare pleads with the aristocratic young man, probably the Earl of Southampton, to whom the sonnets are addressed, to marry and beget a child. 18 and afterwards, this theme undergoes a fundamental change. The poet now advances the cause of his own love for the young aristocrat, claiming that through his poetry he will immortalize his beauty and their love. So long as men see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. This is the classical situation of a poet appealing to his patron to grant him favors and his friendship. In Sonnet 65, this idea is still retained. It becomes almost submerged under a much more serious view of the destructiveness of time. There's nothing in the material world, not brass, nor stone, nor earth, nor boundless sea, but sad mortality o'ersways their power. There follows a vision of total destruction of everything by time. Shakespeare's no longer concerned with weighing the ruination effected by time within history against the immortality bestowed by poetry within presumably the same history. He's concerned with the end of history, the total destruction of everything in the world and the earth itself, and, unless it's spared by some miracle, poetry and the immortality it bestows. One word is used to summarize the values of human living which are subject to destruction by time. This word is beauty. Contemplating the havoc wrought by sad mortality, the poet asks, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea whose action is no stronger than a flower? What gives the sonnet this tremendous and terrifying force is not merely that it depicts for us a vision of the end of the world, but that it evokes a continuing process of destruction happening always, every moment. There's always this measuring of the forces of destruction against beauty and all that beauty stands for. The poem is not really concerned with the future. It's written in the present tense. Sad mortality o'ersways the power of brass, stone, earth, and boundless sea, now, at this moment. And when the poet asks the question, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, it doesn't merely refer to the future. The verb shall has the force of the verb can. How with this rage can beauty hold a plea, now and indeed at any time? The destruction of the world by time is seen as a process happening all the time within nature. Moreover, the imagery is drawn from human conflicts, war, struggles between the powers of this world. Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wrackful siege of battering days? This is the imagery of siege warfare. The struggle which the sonnet describes is between the infinitely fragile forces of exposed and innocent life and the overwhelming powers of destruction bringing death, that Shakespeare felt there was a reversal of the delicate, truthful, sensitive, life-giving forces within the world as he saw it, is apparent in the sonnet that follows, beginning, "Tired with all these, for restful death I cry," in which he contrasts in a formidable catalogue of prodigious items the reversal of the true nature of life within the world by those who are in positions of worldly power and able to control the lives of others under their sway. And art made tongue-tied by authority, and folly doctor-like controlling skill, and simple truth miscalled simplicity, and captive good attending captain ill. It's against the negation of everything pure, true, simple, beautiful within life by wealth, ignorance, folly, bad faith, dishonor in positions of power, that beauty cannot hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower. I've chosen this sonnet 65 because every day I'm haunted by the line, whose action is no stronger than a flower. Beauty being linked in the lines that follow with time's best jewel and the black ink in which the poet's love shines bright. Myself, I hardly find it possible today to open a newspaper and read of the insensate violence in the world, or of competition between states piling up nuclear armaments in their fear of one another, or of images dangled before us of the total destruction of the world in final war, without the lines popping into my mind. How with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Well, the poem speaks also of the miracle which perhaps has might, so that in black ink my love may still shine bright. Also, although the action of beauty is no stronger than a flower immeasurably weak in comparison with the forces of destruction, is organic life and might spring up against the ruins. And organic life is indeed a miracle, sufficient for us, though, to reflect that the miracle does not lie in any message of hope or despair which the poem offers, but simply in the power of the imagination to set before our minds the situation relating beauty to destruction in this poetry, which lives on and lives on.
Since brass, nor stone, nor earth, nor boundless sea, but sad mortality o'ersways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wrackful siege of battering days, when rocks impregnable are not so stout, nor gates of steel so strong, but time decays? Oh, fearful meditation! Where, alack, shall time's best jewel from time's chest lie hid? Or what strong hand can hold his swift foot back? Or who his spoil of beauty can forbid? Oh, none, unless this miracle have might, that in black ink my love may still shine bright.
Tired with all these, for restful death I cry, as to behold desert a bevel, and even trimmed in jollity, and purity unhappily forsworn, and gilded honor shamefully misplaced, and maiden virtue rudely strumpeted, and right perfection wrongfully disgraced, and strength by limping sway disabled, and art made tongue-tied by authority, and folly doctor-like controlling skill, and simple truth miscalled simplicity, and captive good attending captain ill. Tired with all these, from these would I be gone, save that to die I leave my love alone.
I came across it on one of those days when a writer wants to remind himself how it is that other writers assemble their words. I think on this occasion, I just wanted to remind myself how often Shakespeare used a metaphor and how often he simply allowed his perception to make its impact. And I stumbled into Sonnet 66, as to behold a beggar born. That was me. After 25 years of writing plays, I was still having to knock at doors to ask, please, will you read and consider doing my plays? A depressingly humiliating process. And Shakespeare reminded me, 400 years later, behold, the artist is born always to be a beggar, always asking favors, always being able. Then would come back replies from readers or directors telling me this was wrong and that was wrong, as though only they, but never I, could be right. I've not only been writing for a long time, I've not only thought a great deal about my craft, I've also spent a lot of time working on this play. I know how it'll work when it's actually on stage. And they become embarrassed and stutter and retreat and refuse to talk because, poor writers, they never know what they're doing. And what do I find myself confronting? Folly controlling skill. And it's so dispiriting, so demoralizing. One's confidence is constantly being sapped. Strength by limping sway disabled. Limping sway. What a marvelous image that is. Not only of the hesitant theatre producer, the timid artistic director, looking over their shoulders to see what made the last success, ignoring the merit of the work itself, being swayed by this or that external consideration, limping towards a decision. Not only is it an accurate image of the theatre's timorousness, but it works right across the board in film, publishing, television, journalism, industry. So many working in those fields meet with limping sway. No, can't do that. No, that would never work. The dreary lethargy of the spirit where it operates in a captain's capacity and demoralizes talent. It's more comforting to work side by side with mediocrity, with what's safe and known and less disturbing. Captive good, ill. And what accompanies all good ideas but the simple truth of them? For the people to whom the ideas come, their worth is so self-evident that they're left speechless to defend them. They shouldn't need defending. There they are. They speak for themselves. But no, one is accused of being unworldly, inexperienced. No matter how experienced one is, they always seem to know better. And so, simple truth is miscalled simplicity. Sometimes the powers that be do pause to consider what it is one is offering. A play, an article, a suggestion for expanding the business. And then, how like an idiot one behaves, overflowing with gratitude and trust. And they can see the trusting fool before them, to whom they can lie, whom they can cheat, mislead, and finally betray. Purest faith becomes unhappily forsworn. But finally, having overcome the doubts of management, fought with the director of the play to defend passages and lines, explained meanings and rhythms to the actors, after having come the myriad problems involved in mounting a play, painting a painting, designing a building, constructing a car, launching a new enterprise of any kind, the impotent condemnators. Now, I don't want to become involved in a diatribe against the function of criticism. It is an essential part of a healthy democracy, and frequently is well placed. But so often it is not. It's casual, ill-informed, sourly motivated, irresponsibly proffered, and then right perfection becomes wrongfully disgraced. And how often, tired with all these, from these would I be gone. But there's more. While one's work is being ignored or put down, business initiatives suppressed, social justice neglected, merit of any kind dismissed, there, to rub salt on the wounds, the mediocre are elevated, the trivial is praised, the meretricious applauded, and a great gleeful fuss made about noisy and clamoring silliness. Or, as the poet puts it, and needy nothing, trimmed in jollity and gilded honor, shamefully misplaced. I can't, I must confess, for obvious and all too apparent reasons, say too much about maiden virtue rudely strumpeted. But when I read, and art made tongue-tied by authority, I gasp. What resonance a line like that has. It not only sums up all the others, but it reaches out to the much crueler, the more criminal acts of political censorship which take place in those parts of the world wherever there exists a state-dominated society that is fearful for its power. Well, at 50, I'm very, very tired with all these. But I would not like to be gone. Nor do I think Shakespeare really wanted to be gone. What he wanted to communicate was twofold: to list what in life made life a depressing experience, and by contrast, to say how much in life was worth living. From these would I be gone, save that to die I leave my love alone. The sonnet was a glorious, reassuring discovery for me. I could immediately translate it into the prose of my own feelings. I don't want to die because there's too much that I love. And because I love it, so I'm more depressed by what is ugly, mean, stupid, oppressive, and angry at anything destructive of that lovely human spark with which we are all born.
Tired with all these, for restful death I cry, as to behold desert a beggar born, and needy nothing trimmed in jollity, and purest faith unhappily forsworn, and gilded honor shamefully misplaced, and maiden virtue rudely strumpeted, and right perfection wrongfully disgraced, and strength by limping sway disabled, and art made tongue-tied by authority, and folly doctor-like controlling skill, and simple truth miscalled simplicity, and captive good attending captain ill. Tired with all these, from these would I be gone, save that to die I leave my love alone.
Farewell. Thou art too dear for my possessing, and like enough thou know'st thy estimate. The charter of thy worth gives thee releasing. My bonds in thee are all determinate. For how do I hold thee but by thy granting? And for that riches, where is my deserving? The cause of this fair gift in me is wanting, and so my patent back again is swerving. Thyself thou gavest thy own worth, then not knowing, or me to whom thou gavest it, else mistaking. So thy great gift, upon misprision growing, comes home again on better judgment making. Thus have I had thee, as a dream doth flatter. In sleep a king, at waking no such matter.
I find this a disconcerting poem. Generous, tragic, but still a wet and slippery poem. Like an oyster, it slips down live. It's inside me, part of me, before I've had a chance to question it or chew it over. Farewell, thou art my possessing. Thus have I had thee as a dream doth flatter, in sleep a king. Exactly, yes. But yes, exactly what? Why is the feeling in it so familiar? Who's the poem written to? What's it about? Where does the feeling in it come from? It would be a mistake, I think, to go for strictly factual answers based on what we know or guess of Shakespeare's life. None of us hearing the poem can hope to respond to it as Shakespeare. In the first instance, anyway, we respond to it as us. And our response to this, as to any other work of art, won't necessarily be any the less valid for our not knowing what the artist really meant. When I look at a seashell, mother of pearl glinting in the sun, I don't give a jot for the life story of the snail that made it. If I cup the seashell to my ear, it's not the snail I hear. It's not even the echo of the sea. It's simply the echo of myself. To understand this poem, we don't need to know the facts of Shakespeare's life. But Shakespeare being Shakespeare, there's not a chance we shall be allowed to remain ignorant for long. Just suppose that this poem had really reached us from the blue, washed up on the beach in an old Elizabethan bottle. Suppose we knew nothing of its provenance, neither who wrote it, whom it was written to, or when. Before we could say, Dr. Rouse, 100 Shakespeare scholars gathered round, 100 detectives to scrape away the barnacles, each to emerge with his own, the only possible, historical interpretation. Shakespeare betrayed and abandoned by his friend. Shakespeare rejected by the patron who'd supported him through the lean years of the plague. Marlowe, Shakespeare's rival, dead in a pub brawl. Oh yes? It's not just that I don't want to know, it's that actually I don't believe a word of it. They've got the wrong poem, or the poem somehow got into the wrong bottle. Think about it. Just listen to what it is that Shakespeare's saying. For how do I hold thee but by thy granting? And for that riches, where is my deserving? The cause of this fair gift in me is wanting. Whatever else it is, it's surely not an honest description of Shakespeare's relation to his lover, let alone his relation to a rival playwright or to whoever paid him for his poems. Conceivably, Shakespeare's parting from a lover or a patron might have provided the occasion for the poem. Such a parting might even possibly have provided a trigger for those feelings. But there's a world of difference between the trigger and the trap it springs. John Donne's Ode to a Flea isn't a poem about fleas, any more than Schubert's so-called Trout Quintet is a quintet about trout. If Shakespeare meant this poem to be about his real feelings for his friend, then he was fooling someone. But perhaps the person he was fooling was himself. The reason, W.H. Auden said, the reason why it's so difficult for a poet not to tell lies is that in poetry, all facts and all beliefs cease to be true or false and to become interesting possibilities. Auden, himself a poet, may well have been inclined to think that there was something very special about poets, about himself and Shakespeare. But the fact is, we all tell lies. We all live in a world of interesting possibilities, and never more than when we assess our own relationships to others. We fall in love, we fall out of love, we think ourselves honored by someone's friendship, we think ourselves betrayed by someone else's infidelity, but we seldom pay more than a glancing nod towards reality. And so we live out our loves, hopes, fears in fantasy, inventing the connections which we can't or won't see clearly, looking to our own imagination for a possible label, a possible description of our feelings and our situation. And our heads being full of half-hoped-for, half-remembered possibilities, we give them, if nothing else, a poetical reality, airy nothings, for which we find in this relationship a local habitation and a name. I love you. No, it's my idea of you I love. I grieve for you. No, my idea of you I grieve for. It's not my relationship to you I'm describing. It's my relationship to the present embodiment of a host of earlier hopes and dreams. So, who in imagination is Shakespeare saying farewell to? There's only one person I can think of to whom the sentiments might possibly apply. Not a lover, not a patron, or rather both a lover and a patron, and much more besides. The partner of everybody's first affair, the first to give herself to us, and the first to take herself away. I'm talking, you'll guess, of everyone's own mother. For how do I hold thee, but by thy granting? And for that riches, where is my deserving? Thyself thou gavest, thy own worth then not knowing, or me to whom thou gavest it, else mistaking. But my bonds in thee are all determined. Our attachment could last so long. And I, who mother's darling once thought himself a king, have now grown up to find myself deserted. No such matter, no such mater. Farewell, mother. It's a relationship and a parting we all know, one which we all, as poets, carry with us into adulthood, coloring every subsequent love and parting we encounter. No wonder we find the poem so slippery, mysterious, if familiar. This isn't Shakespeare's poem, it's ours. And so, like the seashell, we can throw it back into the sea. It will wash
Thou art too dear for my possessing, and like enough thou know'st thy estimate. The charter of thy worth gives thee releasing. My bonds in thee are all determinate. For how do I hold thee but by thy granting? And for that riches, where is my deserving? The cause of the saved in thee is wanting, and so my judgment back again is swerving. Thyself thou gavest, thy own worth then not knowing, or me to whom thou gavest it else mistaking. So thy great gift upon misprision growing comes home again on better judgment making. Thus have I had thee as a dream doth flatter, in sleep a king, but waking no such matter.
Some glory in their birth, some in their skill, some in their wealth, some in their body's force, some in their garments, though newfangled ill, some in their hawks and hounds, some in their horse. And every humour hath his adjunct pleasure, wherein it finds a joy above the rest. But these particulars are not my measure. All these I better in one general best. Thy love is better than high birth to me, richer than wealth, prouder than garments cost, of more delight than hawks or horses be. And having thee, of all men's pride, I boast. Wretched in this alone, that thou mayst take all this away, and me most wretched make.
Sandwiched between two sonnets teeming with the emotion of unrequited love comes this sonnet, a rhetorical celebration of those attributes most coveted by the Elizabethan age, essential in view of government to the ordered structure of society. High birth, skill in the sense of cleverness and knowledge, fine clothes, the possession of hawks and hounds, and a stable of thoroughbred horses. Some glory in their birth. This obsession with descent manifested itself everywhere in an age of new aristocracy, one that owed its ennoblement to the Tudors and its wealth to the Reformation. The College of Arms, which is still with us, was the institutional expression of this mania with pedigree. The claim, for instance, by the ruling family to be descended from Adam or the Trojan king Brutus was matched by equally fictitious ancestors for the new would-be aristocracy. Grants of arms soared in late 16th century England, and heraldry played a central part in interior decoration, as any great house amply demonstrates, from the plaster ceilings to the panelling and the painted glass in the windows. And no great Elizabethan tomb is complete without a pyrotechnic display of it. An extreme instance of this preoccupation with birth and descent is John Lord Lumley. His northern seat, Lumley Castle, still contains part of his scheme of dynastic self-apotheosis. One gateway is surrounded with a frieze of white marble, bearing the arms of all his ancestors. In the great hall, there still hang most of the 16 full-length portraits of his ancestors back to 1066, which he commissioned, all, of course, totally imaginary. Nearby, in the church of Chester Street, he created 22 tombs to these ancestors. These he either moved from somewhere or had made. So cramped was he for space to get them all in that the effigies had to be chopped off below the knees. In addition to this, he accumulated a collection of no less than 200 portraits of kings and queens and great contemporaries. No wonder James I, when travelling south in 1603 and shown this genealogical megalomania, was led to remark, "I didna ken Adam's other name was Lumley." But perhaps the other attribute in the sonnet which sticks most in the mind is the last. Some in their garments, though newfangled ill. It's the only one of the series which Shakespeare qualifies in any way with a note of disapproval. It strikes almost a puritanical note, suggesting the attitude of an older generation to a younger, a perennial saga in the history of fashion, equally familiar to our own age in the outrage evoked by the velvets and ruffles of the 1960s or 1980s punk. And if the Earl of Southampton is the hero of the sonnets, we only have to turn to portraits of this decadent young man to see his foppish attire. His hair worn long with a curling lovelock onto his shoulders, his doublet of white satin, his gloves with their embroidered gauntlets, and his trunk hose thick laid with gold lace. The gloves in the picture remind us that Shakespeare's father was a glover, so that he was born into the world of clothes. To trace the elaboration of gloves alone through his lifetime is to chronicle an explosion of ostentation, as the cuffs gradually expanded until they were encrusted with jewels, gold and silver lace, and embroidery in multicolored silks. The sonnet, in fact, pinpoints this vast elaboration in dress that had taken place since the 1560s and 70s. By the 90s, when this sonnet was written, clothes had entered a phase of unprecedented fantasy. Ruffs expanded into vast cartwheels of starched lace. Doublets were slashed and prinked as one fabric overlay another. Embroidery serpentined its way across the figure in a phantasmagoria right down to clocks on stockings. Women's dress went even further in its denial of any connection with the figure beneath. Hair was piled high and adorned with jewels that caught the light. Onto ruffs like enormous fans, flowers and tiny glittering pendants were pinned. Both the sleeves and the huge skirts of the farthingales were covered with embroidery resembling a mobile garden. Huge wired veils and false sleeves hung to the ground to enlarge even more the silhouette. For the Elizabethans, dress was an external assertion of rank and degree. Portraits recalled the clothes with as much care, perhaps more than the face, for they are an index of status to the onlookers. These are icons set apart, and there's no question that they could belong to any other than a closed, aristocratic world that took for granted no form of manual labour and betokened an army of domestics to support such conspicuous consumption. As in all hierarchical societies, these clothes restricted the movement of the wearer, resulting in a formality gesture that emphasized their superiority. It was a European phenomenon whose exclusivity was reinforced by sumptuary laws, which reserved the use of certain fabrics and furs to the royal family and the nobility. Shakespeare would have surely known a famous soliloquy accompanying a woodcut of an Englishman holding in one hand a length of cloth and in the other a pair of tailor's shears. I am an Englishman, and naked I stand here, musing in my mind what raiment I shall wear. For now I will wear this, and now I will wear that. Now I will wear I cannot tell what. All new fashions be pleasant to me. I will have them, whether I thrive or thee. And perhaps there's something else, a comment of a kind made by every foreign visitor to Tudor England. The English are very inconsistent and desirous of novelties, changing their costumes every year, both men and women. Shakespeare's ultimate mismarriage of rank and fashion comes in Twelfth Night, in the figure of Malvolio, who manages Olivia's household, but whose dress and suit of love were totally inappropriate to his lowly station. He will come to her in yellow stockings, and 'tis a colour she abhors, and cross-gartered, a fashion she detests, and he will smile upon her, which will now be so unsuitable to her disposition, being addicted to a melancholy as she is, that it cannot but turn him into a notable contempt.
Some glory in their birth, some in their skill, some in their wealth, some in their body's force, some in their garments, though newfangled ill, some in their hawks and hounds, some in their horse. And every humour hath his adjunct pleasure, wherein it finds a joy above the rest. But these particulars are not my measure. All these I better in one general best. Thy love is better than high birth to me, richer than wealth, prouder than garments cost, of more delight than hawks or horses be. And having thee, of all men's pride, I boast. Wretched in this alone, that thou mayst take all this away, and me most wretched make. They that have power to hurt and will do none, that do not do the thing they most do show, who, moving others, are themselves as stone, unmoved, cold, and to temptation slow. They rightly do inherit heaven's graces, and husband nature's riches from expense. They are the lords and owners of their faces, others but stewards of their excellence. The summer's flower is to the summer sweet, though to itself it only live and die. But if that flower with base infection meet, the basest weed outbraves his dignity. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds.
Who are these extremely chilling people that Shakespeare is writing about? Well, I'm a lawyer, and here in the dining hall at Gray's Inn, the home of lawyers, where lawyers have met and passed the port and discussed death sentences and judicial preferment, since Shakespeare's day, an answer springs to mind. Who, moving others, are themselves as stone? They must be the advocates, the judges, the politicians of all time. Those whose faces are all around us here, aloof and judicial, giving absolutely nothing away. Like, well, do you remember the great Viceroy of India? My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person. My face is smooth, my hair is sleek. I dine at Blenheim once a week. Or think of the most hypocritical of hanging judges. The man who believed in the death sentence for adultery until he fell in love himself. Remember Shakespeare's description of Angelo in Measure for Measure. They say this Angelo was not made by man and woman after the downright way of creation. Some report a sea maid spawned him, that he was begot between two stockfishes. But it is certain that when he makes water, his urine is congealed ice. That I know to be true. That was Judge Angelo, a man whose blood is very snow broth. Those are the sort of people who, moving others, are themselves a stone, the lords and masters of their faces. And a supreme example of them is this man. Well, let's come back to him later. Let's consider for a moment why Shakespeare came to use this extraordinary image, the figure of the cold-hearted public man who holds himself aloof as others suffer. Of course, the sonnets are about all sorts of things: time, immortality, death, and art. But there's an autobiographical story in the sonnets, and I'm sure Shakespeare's poems are about real life and not some vague and abstract poetical allegory. They're saturated with personal suffering, with anger and jealousy and remorse. And in the part of the story we're considering, the fair friend, whom I assume is the Earl of Southampton, is beginning to be suspected of emotional hypocrisy, of not doing the things he most does show. In the previous sonnet, Shakespeare speaks of himself as a deceived husband who sees sweet love in his friend's face, whate'er his heart's workings be. Now, the Earl of Southampton had political ambitions, which led him to the Tower after the Essex Revolt, but he lived on to become the favorite of James I, to invest in Virginia and the Hudson Bay Company, to succeed in that two-faced political world that Shakespeare could never inhabit. So, the image of personal hypocrisy in friendship and love is stretched to include that great hypocritical world of rulers and judges who have to pretend to wisdom and virtue when they may be merely vain and self-seeking. For under the judge's robes, Shakespeare has said in a wonderful passage in King Lear, is a naked man subject to all the lusts and temptations he denounces in others. Through tattered clothes small vices do appear, robes and furred gowns hide all. And then, when he's done with this devastating portrait of certain public characters, Shakespeare attacks hypocrisy with another image, and an image coming from gardens and the country. If a flower is struck with disease, it becomes worse than a weed, and the more ornate and exotic the lily, the more rank it becomes if infected by that fatal disease, hypocrisy and inner corruption. And that brings us back to him. For surely there was no rarer bloom in the Elizabethan and Jacobean political garden than Francis Bacon, Baron Verulam, Viscounts and Albans. Francis Bacon was called to the bar here, in this hall, the place where Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors was first performed as part of some Christmas festivities. He was the friend and protege of Southampton's friend, the Earl of Essex, on whom Bacon depended for preferment. And after the Essex Revolt, Bacon was the Earl's most viciously hostile prosecuting counsel. Bacon had one of the finest intellects of the Renaissance. He delighted in beautiful houses, good-looking pages, and sweet perfumes. He set himself to analyze all natural and scientific experience, and so to discover the true meaning of life. He saw the universe as a great labyrinth to which he alone possessed the key. He finally had to confess to instances of bribery and corrupt dealings in chancery suits. And he died stuffing a goose with snow in an attempt to discover modern methods of refrigeration. He is perfectly described in this sonnet, although most of his long, devious career was ahead of him when Shakespeare wrote it. Bacon was the lord and master of his face. He could move others and remain perfectly cold and endlessly calculating. It's impossible to suppose that Francis Bacon could ever have had the humility to write such a savage expose of himself as this sonnet. And if such an absurd suggestion calls for an answer, this sonnet is a crushing reply to anyone who could possibly imagine that Francis Bacon, Viscount St. Albans, could ever have written the works of his infinitely greater contemporary, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's ideal man is far removed from the robed justice. He is honest Horatio, loyal Kent. He's not the master of his face. His face simply has to express his true feelings. You remember how Kent describes himself in King Lear. I do profess to be no less than I seem, to serve him truly that will put me in trust, to love him that is honest, to converse with him that is wise and says little, to fight when I cannot choose, and to eat no fish. All these cold characters must have eaten vast quantities of fish.
They that have power to hurt and will do none, that do not do the thing they most do show, who, moving others, are themselves as stone, unmoved, cold, and to temptation slow, they rightly do inherit heaven's graces, and husband nature's riches from expense. They are the lords and owners of their faces, others but stewards of their excellence. The summer's flower is to the summer sweet, though to itself it only live and die. But if that flower with base infection meet, the basest weed outbraves his dignity. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds.
Not mine own fears, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come, can yet the lease of my true love control, supposed as forfeit to a confined doom. The mortal moon hath her eclipse endured, and the sad augurs mock their own presage. Incertainties now crown themselves assured, and peace proclaims olives of endless age. Now with the drops of this most balmy time, my love looks fresh, and death to me subscribes, since spite of him, I'll live in this poor rhyme, while he insults o'er dull and speechless tribes. And thou in this shalt find thy monument, when tyrants' crests and tombs of brass are spent.
This sonnet always comes as something of a shock. It's virtually the only one which seems to specifically refer to events in the world outside. Needless to say, Elizabethan scholars have had a field day trying to identify these events, what Shakespeare meant by the eclipse of the moon and the olives of endless age. In the case of the former, people have thought it referred to the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the Queen's escape from the conspiracy of Dr. Lopez in the winter of 1593-4, her entrance into her 63rd year, her grand climacteric in 1595, her illness in 1599. The Armada is far too early, and the others too minor to match what the words and phrases cast as a great moment in history. I believe that this can only refer to the year 1603, when Queen Elizabeth I died and her cousin James VI of Scotland ascended the throne. The mortal moon hath her eclipse endured. For any educated Elizabethan, this could only be one person, the Queen. During the 45 years of her rule, Elizabeth became the focus of a complex cult, which as the reign progressed was deliberately built up and found expression in the multiplicity of names and attributes associated with her. Literature and painting were two major vehicles for this propaganda, which was both directly and indirectly state-inspired. The Queen was presented to her people in spectacular scenes of calculated pageantry, designed to evoke their loyalty. Her portraits became increasingly fantastic as she grew older. Painted and poetic tributes parted from reality as they celebrated her as sovereign and lady, as here in the ermine portrait. The branch of olive in her hand and the sword at her side allude to the peace and justice of her rule. The white fur of the little ermine that rests on her arm symbolizes her purity as the sonnet lady. In the last decade of the reign, she moved perpetually bathed in a sunset glory, as though immortal. The most familiar and potent of these names was the celebration of her as the moon goddess, Diana, or Cynthia. Sir Walter Raleigh began this as an esoteric personal cult in the 1580s. In his portrait dated 1588, we see him wearing the Queen's personal colours of black and white, bedecked with pearls, another virgin symbol. If we look at the top left-hand corner of the picture, we see the object of his devotion, the crescent-shaped moon. By the 1590s, the cult had become public. In 1591, when the Queen visited Lord Hertford's house at Eltham, a vast crescent-shaped lake was dug in honour of Cynthia, the wide ocean's empress, on which was enacted a symbolic drama in which the might of Catholic Spain and of the Pope was vanquished by the force of England. It's often been suggested that it's this entertainment to which Shakespeare refers in his A Midsummer Night's Dream. The dream is Shakespeare's homage to Elizabeth as the moon goddess. From start to finish, it's saturated with moon imagery, alluding to her presence at the great marriage the play celebrates. No problem there, Shakespeare knew it all. The Queen then is dead, and the sad augurs mock their own presage. In other words, their predictions have proved false. In one aspect, this refers to one of the wilder sides of the royal cult, a belief in her immortality and eternal youth. This is deep-rooted in the moon cult. A year before her death, her knights staged a spectacle in her honour, and a song entitled Of Cynthia was sung. Time's young hours attend her still, and her eyes and cheeks do fill with fresh youth and beauty. All her lovers old do grow, but in their hearts they do not sow in their love and duty. In her portrait miniatures, which were worn almost as talismans by her devotees, she is depicted precisely in this way. And her face is not that of a woman nearing 70, but of a young girl. In portrait after portrait, we're presented with a vision of her as Queen of Beauty or Beauty's Rose. In the famous rainbow portrait, her hair falls cascading in ringlets onto her shoulders.
Take, oh, take those leaves
In her hand she clasps the rainbow, symbolizing the peace she brings her people, while on top of her crown there's a crescent moon.
And those eyes at break of day, lights that...
The mood of the picture echoes that of the sonnet. There's a prophetic quality, a visionary quality, the promise of an unending golden age.
seals of love.
On March the 24th, 1603, all that was dust. In the vast outpouring of poetry and prose that followed her death, the eclipse imagery made its inevitable appearance. For silver Cynthia has eclipsed her light, and with her absence makes eternal night. My reading of the sonnet could only square with an allusion to the great Queen's death. Shakespeare publicly refers to it years later in the prophecy which closes his pageant play, Henry VIII. And yet a virgin, a most unspotted lily shall she pass to the ground, and all the world shall mourn her. In 1603, he wasn't moved to overtly mourn, nor was he moved to hail the advent of her successor, James VI. We're so used to the apotheosis of Gloriana and the ultimate disaster of Stuart rule that we forget the euphoria of James's accession. It was indeed this most balmy time. Gone was the fear of civil war, of a new armada, or a Catholic coup. England and Scotland were united. The king became the leader of Protestant Europe, and the long war with Spain ended. In the normal sequence of imagery, olives bring peace, and not the reverse. But surely this reversal refers to something else that was endless. A barren queen was replaced by a king with children. Peace is the perpetual theme of the years 1603 to 4, when the sonnet must have been written. Surely the sonnet is tinged with what has been described as the imperial theme. Notice the key word that follows uncertainties. Crown. Now crown themselves. Midway between the moon and olives, this springs out and emphasizes the dynastic and monarchical imagery of the sonnet. We seem to catch echoes of the history plays, where similarly uncertainties lead up to the golden age of the Tudors. Now that resolution is rewritten in terms of a new dynasty and of a new age.
Not mine own fears, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come, can yet the lease of my true love control, supposed as forfeit to a confined doom. The mortal moon hath her eclipse endured, and the sad augurs mock their own presage. Uncertainties now crown themselves assured, and peace proclaims olives of endless age. Now with the drops of this most balmy time, my love looks fresh, and death to me subscribes, since spite of him I'll live in this poor rhyme, while he insults or dull and speechless tribes. And thou in this shalt find thy monument, when tyrants' crests and tombs of brass are spent.
In the old age, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned, if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress' eyes are raven black, her eyes so suited, and they mourners seem, at such who, not born fair, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so.
This sonnet, the first in the series about Shakespeare's mysteries, gives us a vivid picture of the Dark Lady, whose identity has eluded us for 400 years. In an age when black was not counted fair, the standard of beauty being fairness, or the red gold of the Queen, Shakespeare's mistress's eyes and hair are raven black. This sonnet practically repeats the language of his description of Rosaline in Love's Labour's Lost of just about this date, where Berowne is a skit on himself, and his mistress, Rosaline, is of course the Dark Lady. But who was the Dark Lady of the sonnets? I did not myself think that this would ever be discovered until I found her in the very place where she ought to turn up, here in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. My old friend Agatha Christie used to say that people always overlook the significance of the obvious. And Simon Forman's case books were the obvious place to look. Though actually I wasn't looking for the Dark Lady, and that is often the way the best discoveries are made. Simon Forman was already known to Shakespeare scholars as the only person to give an account of the 4 plays he saw at the Globe Theatre in 1611. But they hadn't looked any further. He was a medico-astrologer to whom the whole spectrum of Elizabethan society came for consultation from the top to the bottom. At the top, he was an acquaintance of Lord Chamberlain, Hunsdon's son, who also became Lord Chamberlain. They were cousins of Queen Elizabeth I, who were responsible for plays and entertainments at court, and were patrons of Shakespeare's company. I found one day there came to consult Forman a young lady who had been kept in pomp and pride as the old Lord Chamberlain's mistress. This was getting very close, for he was the patron of Shakespeare's company. I pricked up my ears, and the next piece of information was that she was Emilia Bassano, daughter of Baptista Bassano, one of the Queen's Italian musicians. When pregnant, she had been discarded and married off to another of the Queen's foreign musicians, Alfonso Lanier. She was down on her luck, very stuck up, after her exalted, if equivocal, position as mistress of the first cousin to the Queen. A lady, but a dubious, semi-foreign dark one, who looked down on her husband, a mere minstrel, she called him. At this moment he was away on the Azores voyage with Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Southampton, whom he knew quite well. Forman found her haughty. She hoped her husband would be knighted, for she wanted to be a lady of title. She was also a bad lot, promiscuous, temperamental, inconstant, determined on getting her own way. She was the only woman in Elizabethan London who frightened Forman. She had some psychic gift, knew about spells and the incantation of spirits. Later on we find that she was well educated, well read in classical history and the Old Testament, quite a good poet, second only to Philip Sidney's sister among the women of that age. When the sonnets were published by Thomas Thorpe many years later, she reacted by publishing her own long poem with its title in Latin, Hail God, King of the Jews. In it, she identifies with the heroines of Old Testament history, Deborah, Jael, Esther, and the Bassanos were possibly Jewish. So Shakespeare was close to this with the Italian Jewish theme of the Merchant of Venice. But immediately after the demeaning portrait of her in the sonnets, she inserted a scathing prose reply to men who defamed women. She was, unique for that age, a strong feminist, very tough and good at standing up for herself. She lived until 1645, a whole generation after the men in her life were dead. Forman's information is still more helpful in giving us the precise dating so that we learn the ages of the people concerned, all of which bears out what Shakespeare tells us. Shakespeare fell for her out of pity for her unworthiness, just at the moment when she was pushed from her high estate, discarded and married off. This was in the autumn of 1592. Shakespeare was then 28, past the halfway mark in his hard-working life. Emilia was more than 5 years younger. Southampton, whom she entangled, then 19. This makes the triangle all the more understandable, as also Shakespeare's humiliating situation between the young folks. In the course of the sonnets, he gives a complete portrait of Emilia, tells us everything about her except her name. In the sonnet following this one, he tells us that she is very musical. How oft when thou my music playest upon that blessed wood whose motion sounds. Bewailing in a later sonnet that his eyes are anchored in the bay where all men ride. He tells us that she was well known at the time, indeed notorious, as indeed she would be, as the mistress of the Lord Chamberlain, patron of Shakespeare's company. He completely corroborates Forman's information that she was stuck up and tyrannical, looked down on him, a mere actor, temperamental and inconstant. When my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies, and promiscuous. Yet she exerted this spell upon him. He couldn't help being infatuated, though he recognized that the ill people spoke of her was true. In nothing art thou black, save in thy deeds, and thence this slander, as I think, proceeds. In the end, she broke her vow to keep on with him, a vow made in bed, by the way. In act thy bed vow broke and new faith torn. And so she broke it off, and the story comes to an end so far as the sonnets are concerned.
In the old age, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned, if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress' eyes are raven black, her eyes so suited, and they mourners seem, at such who not born fair no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so.
How oft, when thou my music playest upon that blessed wood, whose motion sounds with thy sweet fingers, when thou gently swayest the wiry concord that mine ear confounds, do I envy those jacks that nimble leap to kiss the tender inward of thy hand, whilst my poor lips, which should that harvest reap, at the wood's boldness by thee blushing stand. To be so tickled, they would change their state and situation with those dancing chips, o'er whom thy fingers walk with gentle gait, making dead wood more blessed than living lips. Since saucy jacks so happy are in this, give them thy fingers, me thy lips to kiss.
I wonder if the Dark Lady knew the compliment Shakespeare was paying her when he called her my music. Time and time again in his plays, he invokes music when even language, even his language, was not rich enough to express joy. joy at new life, new love, the lost found again, the dead brought back to life. And that music was this woman, this unknown dark lady. She made music, but the music she made was herself. She was his muse in a dark time of his life. And I'm reminded of a much more recent poet, the American Wallace Stevens, walking at night by the sea at Key West. She was the single artificer of the world in which she sang. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, for she was the maker. The young man to whom most of the sonnets are addressed is never Shakespeare's music. We never hear of his playing music. Indeed, he listens to music, sadly. Between them there is neither the physical intimacy nor the corresponding emotional intimacy that would have deserved the compliment, my music. That was Platonic. This is the maelstrom of passion, sex, and all of Shakespeare is involved. She is, in another sense of my music, the whole turbulent symphony of sounds he can hear in his own head, as well as in the world around him. Like life and like himself, she is profoundly ambiguous, black and yet beautiful, a perfume that reeks, a heaven yet a hell. Her mourning eyes become her. She has a large and spacious will, that is, lust, yet that will is himself, Will Shakespeare. He lies with her and she with him. Reflections of her are, of course, thrown up in the dramas. She is the whitely wanton with the velvet brow. She is and is not Cressida. The very thought of sleeping with whom makes his head spin, so that he knows the actual taste of love's thrice repured nectar will be death, swooning destruction. All the sonnets to her are like acts of love. The interplay of rhymes in the 3 quatrains is the rhythm of their embrace. Concord in the sound is balanced by discord in the sense. Both concord and discord reach their climax in the final rhyming couplet. Occasionally, the act of love is also a loving act, as in, yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so. Usually, there is more darkness than light, as in the most terrible, for I have sworn thee fair and thought thee bright, who art as black as hell, as dark as night. But there were good times. The sonnet of the virginals reassures us. They could be playfully erotic. He could make puns about her, and she could smile at them. If this sonnet is miming an actual piece she's playing, it isn't a somber piece. And so we know that their lovemaking, too, wasn't always passionate and tormented. It could be gentle and playful. The first line is music itself. The slightest of pauses after each of the first 2 feet. How oft, when thou. And the next pause or suspension occurring in the middle of a foot, so creating a syncopated effect. My music, music playest. Then the music is allowed to run regularly for the next line and a half, to pause delicately before when thou gently swayest. The jealousy which darkened their relationship comes into this light-hearted poem too, but it is controlled by humor, the pun on the jacks, keys, or rogues that nimbly leap to kiss her hand. This isn't the sick jealousy of Leontes, still virginaling upon his palm. But what an erogenous imagination Shakespeare had. For him, the stroke of a finger conjured up the carnal act, not because he was sick, like Leontes, but because his normal sensibility was almost unbearably acute. The nerve cells of his skin felt even the hurt of a snail, or as the snail, whose tender horns being hit, shrinks backward in his shelly cave with pain, and there, all smothered up in shade doth sit, long after fearing to creep forth again. To kiss the tender inward of thy hand. I feel closer to Shakespeare in that line than almost anywhere else in his writing. The combination of tender, one of his favorite words, and inward, used as a noun, gives me the physical sensation, the titillation, the tickling of the stroked palm. I hear an echo of another line, referring to another exquisitely delicate part of the body, Juliet's words to Romeo at dawn. It was the nightingale and not the lark that pierced the fearful hollow of thine ear. Shakespeare's senses battered him so acutely that he had to be fastidious. One imagines that he didn't care for greasy wenches any more than he liked greasy dishes. But he liked complex women. He liked the wiry concord of her instrument, or, to judge by the black wires, he praised and dispraised elsewhere her hair. The way she could dance while walking with gentle gait. She was as subtle and complex as his own imagination. That's why she brought him rapture and torment. That's why she was his music.
How oft, when thou my music playest upon that blessed wood, whose motion sounds with thy sweet fingers, when thou gently swayest the wiry concord that mine ear confounds, do I envy those jacks that nimble leap to kiss the tender inward of thy hand, whilst my poor lips, which should that harvest reap, at the wood's boldness by thee blushing stand. To be so tickled, they would change their state and situation with those dancing chips, o'er whom thy fingers walk with gentle gait, making dead wood more blessed than living lips. Since saucy jacks so happy are in this, give them thy fingers, me, thy lips to kiss.
Two loves I have, of comfort and despair, which, like two spirits, do suggest me still. The better angel is a man right fair, the worser spirit a woman colored ill. To win me soon to hell, my female evil tempteth my better angel from my side, and would corrupt my saint to be a devil, wooing his purity with her foul pride. And whether that my angel be turned fiend, suspect I may, yet not directly tell. But being both from me, both to each friend, I guess one angel in another's hell. Yet this shall I ne'er know, but live in doubt, till my bad angel fire my good one out.
If all the 154 sonnets except for this were to disappear tomorrow, we would possess still the heart of the mythic story Shakespeare tells. Yet this sonnet is perhaps the least poetic in the entire sequence. Its language prosaic, its cadences jarring, its tone oddly affectless. Though it evokes throughout names associated with the realm of the damned, devil, evil, fiend, foul pride, and hell, it never reaches the level of inspired blasphemy or attains the pitch of true invective. Moreover, despite the suggestiveness of its first end rhyme, despair, it falls short of real melancholy. Instead, its final couplet betrays a kind of mordant glee in the catastrophe which has befallen the poet, his mistress, and his beloved friend. It is as if all that the poet would have us believe he had hoped against hope would never happen on some deeper level he had wished. Despite the pretended disclaimer of certainty in the phrase, live in doubt, the poem ends in the indicative rather than the conditional mode. Till my bad angel fire my good one out, he prophesies, as if it were a foregone conclusion. Meaning we must understand, since in Elizabethan slang, hell signifies the female pudenda as well as the place of eternal punishment, even as fire refers to venereal as well as infernal burning, that the woman he hates himself for desiring is destined to infect the boy he loves to love with gonorrhea. If this seems an almost comic anticlimax to all that has gone before, this is in part due to Shakespeare's failure to find rhythms and words able to convert his vision into resonant song. Perhaps he had overreached himself in trying to versify simultaneously his response to the fair youth, whose love represented an eros which transcends the weakness of our fallen flesh, and the dark lady who embodied the baleful power of post-lapsarian passion. Almost always, therefore, he had treated them separately. In praise of his beloved boy, he had managed to produce lyrics of unsurpassed splendor and grace. Despite their disarming simplicity, they seldom fall into banality, nor does the paucity of their themes betray them into monotony. Indeed, it's hard to choose from among them, though I myself have a special fondness for those which, beginning with a simple monosyllable when, fall almost invariably into what is for me the most haunting of Shakespearean cadences. When I do count the clock that tells the time, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Yet quite as moving as such poems celebrating the dream of a love too pure to be possible, but in which for that very reason we must for our soul's sake believe, are those hymning the dark necessity of carnal lust which we can deny only at the price of disavowing our bodies. The latter Shakespeare identifies with the female principle. And to the black-haired, black-eyed, lying woman who incarnates it, he dedicated a group of sonnets, considerably fewer in number than those to the fair-haired youth, but in their troubled complexity of equal appeal. Some of them, indeed, My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, for instance, and when my love swears that she is made of truth, are nearly perfect examples of their kind, dissolving the sexual nausea and self-hatred into a malicious play of wit whose language and music is fully Shakespearean and undeniably beautiful. When, however, Shakespeare attempts to deal in a single poem with both, his verse refuses to rise to the final heights of poetry. Yet he tries several times, most clearly in this sonnet, which, beginning as an account of one who would direct all that is noble in love toward one object and all that is vile toward another, ends with the discovery of the two in each other's arms, the noble contaminated by the vile. The notion of two loves, one redemptive and one destructive, is scarcely new, appearing first perhaps in Plato's Symposium and profoundly altered even as it is reinvented by the poets of courtly love, whose glorification of woman as a source of salvation culminates in Dante's figure of Beatrice. But Shakespeare, almost alone in Christian Europe, which had inherited from the scriptures a deep contempt for pederasty, dared identify love as grace with a boy, love as sin with woman. But the aroma of paganism, the taint of homosexuality, clings to such a strategy, which seems doomed, therefore, to end in guilt and recantation. And indeed, in the fable, the myth of the sonnets, it does. Surmising at last his two loves in each other's arms, the poet realizes that corruption was from the start implicit in the presumably chaste relationship between himself and his friend. No male he had surely always known, except perhaps the legendary hero not born of woman, is immune to the evil impulse which constitutes his female inheritance. Scarcely a hero, however, the fair youth is very much his mother's child. Nor can the poet be quite sure that he himself has not played the woman's part, becoming in fantasy at least the dark Venus who destroys what she loves. When the youth falls, at any rate, the poet cannot help suspecting that he has collaborated in that fall, in some sense willed it. In the myth of the sonnets, finally, The poet abandons the solution of Plato's Symposium, which he had so heretically attempted to revive. He opts instead for the Orthodox Christian solution, which advocates the rejection of all human love, however sublimated, in view of the fact that the beauty which prompts it is fragile and transient, dying as everything in nature surely dies. The true ending of the sequence, then, is not the bitter conclusion of 144, but the resigned and hopeful, the profoundly anti-erotic afterword of 146. By terms divine in selling hours of dross, within be fed, without be rich no more, so shalt thou feed on death that feeds on men, and death once dead, there is no more dying then.
Two loves I have, of comfort and despair, which, like two spirits, do suggest me still. The better angel is a man right fair, the worser spirit a woman colored ill. To win me soon to hell, my female evil tempteth my better angel from my side, and would corrupt my saint to be a devil, wooing his purity with her foul pride. And whether that my angel be turned fiend, suspect I may, yet not directly tell. But being both from me, both to each friend, I guess one angel in another's hell. Yet this shall I ne'er know, but live in doubt, till my bad angel fire my good one out.